Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, Howard Thurman, the great African-American theologian of the middle 20th century, told a story. It was about his grandmother, who had been a slave. And he'd read the Bible to her all the time. She loved to hear it. But she had one rule. She insisted that she would listen to any part of the Bible except for anything by the Apostle Paul. She refused to hear anything by the Apostle Paul. And some of you may guess why. See, she had to listen to Paul's admonition for slaves to obey their masters the entire time she was enslaved. And she was not going to do it ever again. And whether it's Paul's views on enslavement, or his views on the role of women, or his views on homosexuality, to many Christians, Paul doesn't have the greatest reputation. Plus, it doesn't help that Paul is not always the easiest to understand. And sometimes it's a little hard to take somebody seriously who actually boasts in their humility, which he does a few times. He uses modes of rhetoric that aren't familiar to many of us, and he's also writing in Koine Greek, a language that very few of us, including myself, understand. And it's so hard to capture the nuances of that ancient language in English. And all these pieces come together to make Paul not just hard for us to want to understand, but just hard to understand. Now, our shifting from the texts today, we move from Acts, where we read about the early church, to the epistle to the Romans, and we'll be going through Romans this month. Now, despite being listed first in Paul's letters in the Bible, Romans may very well have been one of the last letters that Paul wrote. You might notice that the letters of Paul are actually arranged from largest to smallest in the Bible, not by chronology. That's why Romans is first. Romans is seen as the text from Paul when he was much more mature in his thought. And this passage for today comes from the very beginning of that letter. Ancient letters had a particular format, just as letters do today, and for those who still actually write them. Paul introduces himself, and he mentions the recipients of this letter, the church in Rome. And not only was the church in Rome not founded by Paul, but he hasn't even visited them before. So this is really an introduction. He's having to do a lot of extra work here in this letter to demonstrate his credentials, because they may have only heard about him by reputation. They know nothing about him. This community has no existing relationship with Paul. Plus, this is Rome, the center of the empire, and Paul is not from the center. Paul is from the periphery, from a place that today we would call flyover country. You could kind of say that Rome is Des Moines and Paul is like Baxter, except that Baxter was 2 hours away instead of just 1 hour away. So Paul is addressing the cultured, sophisticated elite, and he is not one of those. Would these sophisticated Romans take him seriously? These first 17 verses provide an outline for the rest of his letter. And his thesis, his main point, for those of you who haven't learned about 5-paragraph essays yet, is, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's saving power for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in the righteousness of God it is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." And when Paul talks about Jews and Greeks, that's kind of a shorthand of talking about everybody. I know most of us are like, well, I'm neither a Jew nor Greek. Yeah, it's just a rhetorical device. That's his way of talking about everybody. Now, gospel is central to what Paul is writing about here. Gospel comes from the Old English, Godspell, which means good plus news or story. It is a translation of the ancient Greek evangelion, evangel, which just means good news. And readers of the Jewish scriptures in Greek would know this term from Isaiah 62:6. But it is also a secular term. Emperors and powerful people also had good news. We know of this from a first century inscription that marks the birth of Caesar Augustus and calls it the beginning of good tidings. Does that sound familiar to you? The Christian community, on the other hand, is taking this in a very different direction. When Paul talks about the gospel of Jesus Christ, he is directly rebutting the imperial theology and the imperial ideology of the Roman state, built on Caesar Augustus, the son of the divine Julius Caesar, the Son of God. This good news comes from Judaism, but it is ultimately for everyone. It is the power of God to save. And what do we mean by saving or salvation? Well, in this particular context, Paul uses saving to mean restoring of right relationships with God, right relationships with ourselves, right relationships with each other, and right relationships with all creation. That is what salvation here means. But this is not an easy message. Paul's message is not something easy to take. It is disruptive of the existing social order. Our social, economic, and political world is built on certain principles. Money, power, and fame. The more you have of these, the more you matter. But the gospel rejects pretty much all of those principles. A message that comes from the edge, the periphery, but is preached in the center. It rejects the gospel of Caesar, the one who calls himself the Prince of Peace and the Son of God. Every so often people will say, well, Jesus was unjustly executed. I'm like, well, he did say he was the Prince of Peace and the Son of God, which to Caesar is kind of competition, and Caesar didn't take competition well. But this gospel is coming from the very man that the Roman Empire tried to destroy, Jesus of Nazareth. And the fact that this gospel stands in such sharp contrast with the gospel of Caesar is going to create challenges for those who follow it, because empire doesn't like competition. Empire doesn't like to be challenged. Now, since we're reading Romans, we need to also talk about judgment, since the judgment of God is a theme that comes up here prominently. And it's also not one of those things that we like to hear too much about. It's important to remember that for Paul, since salvation means right relationship with God, self, others, and all creation, that has to be in the back of your mind as you think about what judgment is about. Because judgment of God is how God tries to bring us back to right relationship. Judgment is not about furthering alienation. Judgment is about restoration. And that is something that so many people forget about. What is the point of the judgment of God? It is restoration and healing. Judgment, too, is actually good news, because it shows God's great love, and it's not really about punishment at all. I'll let you take that however you choose to interpret that. Paul's understanding of the gospel is good news of salvation for all. But it stands in opposition to the empire's good news. And it looks very uncultured since it comes from the sticks, as my mom would say. But it also promises to disrupt everything that the citizens of empire hold dear, or everything perhaps we in our age still hold dear. But in that disruption of grace, that disruption will turn out to be the best news